What happens when a Hollywood legend finally decides she's had enough of being interrupted and stands up to one of daytime television's most outspoken hosts? You're about to witness one of the most intense verbal takedowns in The View's history, the moment Jane Fonda absolutely shut down Joy Behar live on national television. The clash was so fierce that the entire studio fell into stunned silence, and by the end of it, Joy Behar looked like she wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. It all began on what seemed like a typical Tuesday morning on The View. The cameras were rolling, the audience was settled, and the hosts were preparing to welcome their guest, the iconic Jane Fonda. At 86, Fonda had seen everything Hollywood could throw at her, from her rise to superstardom to her decades of activism and influence. She'd come on the show to discuss her latest project, but no one expected Joy Behar to turn the interview into a personal interrogation. As Jane Fonda walked onto the set, the audience erupted with applause. Dressed in a crisp white blazer, her silver hair perfectly styled, she radiated confidence. She settled into her seat with the poise only someone with 60 years in the spotlight could carry. "Welcome back to The View, Jane," Whoopi Goldberg said warmly. "Thank you for having me," Jane replied with a gracious smile. But before Jane could even get comfortable, Joy Behar jumped in, blunt as always. "So Jane, I have to ask you something. You've been very vocal about climate change, but don't you think it's a little hypocritical coming from someone who spent decades flying private and living in massive houses?" The question dropped like a bomb. The other hosts exchanged uneasy glances. Jane's expression tightened for a moment, but she stayed composed. "Well, Joy, that's certainly an interesting way to start," she said, a subtle edge in her voice. "I've been transparent about my past and the changes I've made. I've significantly reduced my carbon footprint and used my platform to raise awareness." Joy wasn't satisfied. She leaned forward, her tone sharpening. "Come on, Jane. You can't just claim you've changed and expect everyone to ignore your luxury lifestyle. You're asking regular people to sacrifice while you live comfortably. Don't you see the issue?" The audience murmured as the tension grew. Jane's eyes narrowed, the fire that made her a legend suddenly visible. "Joy, I'm not sure what you're trying to achieve here. Are you interviewing me about my current work, or are you trying to create drama for your show? Because if you're going for drama, you're doing it poorly." Joy's face flushed. She hadn't expected such a direct pushback. "I'm just asking honest questions. I'm being straightforward." "No, Joy," Jane cut in, her voice gaining strength. "You're being rude and confrontational. There is a difference between honest journalism and whatever this is." The other hosts froze. Sunny Hostin looked ready to intervene, Sarah Hines fidgeted nervously, and Whoopi watched closely as if preparing to step in. Feeling cornered, Joy snapped back, "If you can't handle tough questions, Jane, this isn't the place. We don't do softball interviews here." That was the breaking point. "Tough questions," Jane's voice sliced through the room. "Joy, you call that journalism? You ambushed me with poorly researched accusations and didn't give me a chance to actually respond. That's not journalism. That's tabloid sensationalism." Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Jane wasn't finished. "And furthermore, if you had done even the most basic research before this interview, you'd know that I've been living in a smaller home for years. I've eliminated private jet travel from my personal life, and I've donated millions to environmental causes. But you didn't bother to check any of that, did you?" The audience fell utterly silent, hanging on every word. Joy Behar looked stunned that Jane Fonda was pushing back this hard. She stammered, struggling to regain control. "Well, I think our viewers deserve to know about these contradictions," Joy muttered, though all the confidence had drained from her voice. Jane leaned back slightly, a subtle smile forming at the corner of her mouth. "What our viewers deserve, Joy, is honest, respectful dialogue, not whatever this performance is supposed to be." The word performance hit Joy like a slap. Her face went pale as she glanced around the table, hoping for backup, but none of the co-hosts met their eyes. She was on her own. "I don't know what you're implying," Joy said defensively, her voice tightening. I'm not implying anything, Jane replied coolly. I'm stating it directly. You're performing, trying to create conflict where none needs to exist. It's beneath both of us. Joy was rattled. She had come into this interview expecting to intimidate a Hollywood veteran, but instead she was being dismantled piece by piece by someone who had faced tougher critics, activists, politicians, and entire governments. Look, Jane, Joy tried again. I'm just trying to hold you accountable for your actions. Jane let out a low, dismissive laugh, more condescending than amused. Hold me accountable, Joy. You're a talk show host, not a prosecutor. And even if you were, you'd need accurate facts before you start making accusations. The tension was so thick, it felt like the air had stopped moving. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of Joy Behar's unraveling as Jane continued her verbal dismantling. Whoopi finally stepped in, sensing Joy was drowning and the interview was spiraling out of control. Maybe we should move on to talking about your new project, Jane. But Joy, desperate and humiliated, ignored the lifeline. No, wait, I think we need to address this properly. Jane, you've made a career of being controversial. From Vietnam to your political stances, you've never shied away from stirring the pot. So why are you so sensitive now when someone questions you? The audacity of the question stunned the entire studio. Jane Fonda's expression shifted from annoyed to genuinely angry. Joy had crossed a line. Sensitive, Jane's voice was dangerously quiet. Joy, you clearly don't understand the difference between being controversial and being ignorant. What you just said shows you have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. Joy, misreading the moment entirely, pressed on. Well, I'm talking about your anti-war protests, your comments about American soldiers. You can't rewrite history. The studio went dead silent. Even the crew behind the cameras froze. Jane sat still for a long moment before speaking, her voice sharp enough to cut through steel. Facts, Jane said, her voice controlled but razor sharp. Let me give you some actual facts, Joy. I spent years visiting wounded veterans in hospitals. I've worked with veteran organizations for over 50 decades. I've apologized repeatedly for any pain my actions caused, and I've dedicated huge portions of my life to supporting our troops. But you wouldn't know any of that because you didn't bother to research before you opened your mouth. Joy's face drained of color. She knew she had stepped into dangerous territory, yet instead of stopping, she kept digging herself deeper. Well, that may be true, but the perception is still there, Joy stammered. The perception? Jane raised her eyebrows sharply. Joy, you're not reporting on perception. You're creating it. You're spreading misinformation and then hiding behind the excuse that it's what people think. Sarah finally tried to intervene. Maybe we should take a commercial break? But Jane lifted her hand. No, I think we should finish this conversation. Joy started it, so let's see it through. Joy throws like a deer in headlights. She had expected Jane to be an easy target, an elderly actress who would crumble under pressure, but instead she had awakened a force of nature. Jane was dismantling her credibility piece by piece in front of millions. Joy, you have a platform that reaches millions every day. With that platform comes responsibility. You can't just throw around accusations and half-truths because you think it makes good television. I wasn't throwing around accusations, Joy protested weakly.
Yes, you were, Jane shot back without hesitation. From the moment I sat down, you've been firing off statements with no basis, asking loaded questions, and now you're trying to relitigate history you clearly don't understand. This isn't journalism, Joy. This is a hit job. The other hosts looked mortified. Sunny stared down at her hands. Whoopi looked like she was strategizing how to save the show. Sarah appeared shell-shocked. Joy, grasping for control she no longer had, tried one last time. I think you're overreacting, Jane. This is just a normal interview. Jane let out a short laugh of disbelief. Normal? Joy, in a normal interview, the host prepares. They research their guest. They ask thoughtful questions meant to inform their audience. They listen to answers and follow up meaningfully. She leaned forward. You've done none of that. I did prepare, Joy insisted, though even she didn't sound convinced. No, you didn't, Jane said firmly. If you had, you'd know I've spent the last decade working on climate documentaries. You'd know I've been arrested numerous times protesting environmental destruction. You'd know I've invested my own money into renewable energy projects. But instead of asking me about any of that meaningful work, you chose to ambush me with tabloid-level gossip. Joy opened her mouth and closed it again like a fish gasping for air. She had no response, because Jane was right, and everyone in the studio knew it. And another thing, Jane continued, her voice gathering force, your approach isn't just unprofessional, it's lazy. You had the chance to lead a fascinating conversation about activism, about Hollywood's evolution, about the challenges older women face in this industry. Instead, you chose to manufacture fake controversy because you think conflict equals good television. The audience was silent, hanging on every syllable. Some nodded along with Jane, others looked uneasy watching such a complete clinical takedown unfold live. Joy finally found her voice again, though it came out barely above a whisper. No, Joy, Jane said, sitting back down but locking eyes with her. You were trying to score cheap points at my expense. There's a huge difference. Her words settled over the studio like a heavy blanket, and not a single person dared to breathe. Joy Behar seemed smaller somehow, deflated and defeated. She had begun the interview believing she would expose hypocrisy, yet all she had revealed was her own lack of preparation and professionalism. Jane continued, clearly far from finished with her sharp critique. The way you've handled this interview says more about you than about me. You've shown your viewers you're more focused on stirring drama than having meaningful conversations with your guests. Joy attempted one last time to defend herself. Jane tilted her head slightly, a gesture that managed to be both elegant and quietly condescending. Joy, there's a difference between asking tough questions and being rude. Tough questions are researched, relevant, and asked with respect. What you've been doing is being combative for no real reason. The silence that followed was heavy. Joy sat frozen, struggling to process how completely she had been outmaneuvered. But Jane Fonda wasn't done. She had decades of experience handling hostile interviews, difficult directors, and challenging situations, and she was about to use all of it to deliver a final blow. You know what the real tragedy is, Joy? Jane asked, her voice calm but edged with steel. You had the chance to have a meaningful conversation with someone who has lived through 70 decades of American history, who has watched the entertainment industry evolve, who has stood on the front lines of social movements. Instead, you chose to waste everyone's time with a performance. Joy's face drained of color. She looked around the table for support, but her co-hosts avoided eye contact. They clearly weren't going to rescue her. I think maybe we should move on, Joy said quietly, her earlier confidence gone. Oh, now you want to move on, Jane's eyebrow arched. After you've spent all this time making accusations and spreading misinformation, now you want to change the subject. How convenient, Joy. The audience was captivated. This wasn't an interview gone wrong, it was a masterclass in handling a hostile host. Jane Fonda was dismantling everything she had tried to do, with the precision of someone who had faced far worse. Joy, let me ask you something, Jane said, leaning forward. When you prepared for this interview, what exactly did you hope to accomplish? Did you think you were going to expose some major hypocrisy? Did you think I'd crumble under your questioning? What was your end goal? Joy opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was trapped by the directness of the question with no way to escape without admitting her entire approach had been flawed. Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you invited me here not to talk, but to use me as a prop in whatever narrative you already decided to tell your viewers. That's not journalism, Joy. That's exploitation. The word exploitation hung in the air like a verdict. Joy's hands were shaking as she tried to form a response. I never went to... I mean... Jane cut her off with a firm, gentle gesture. Joy, listen carefully, Jane said, with a tone that was soft but carried devastating weight. I've been doing interviews for over 60 years. I've dealt with hostile journalists, aggressive prosecutors, angry protesters, and difficult studio executives. You are none of those things. You're just a talk show host who thought you could score points by being rude to an elderly guest. And that's not just unprofessional, it's sad. The audience gasped. The word sad, delivered so calmly, hit harder than any raised voice ever could.
Joy looked like she had been struck. Whoopi finally stepped in before the situation deteriorated further. "Jane, we appreciate you being here, and I think maybe we should wrap up this segment." But Jane raised her hand politely. "Actually, Whoopi, I'd like to finish. Joy started this, and I think she deserves to hear my full response." Joy looked like she wished she could disappear into her seat, but Jane wasn't letting her off easy. "Joy, you mentioned earlier that I've been controversial throughout my career." "You're absolutely right about that," Jane said, "but there's an important difference between being controversial because you're fighting for something you believe in and being controversial because you don't know how to conduct yourself professionally." She paused, letting the weight of that distinction settle. "When I protested the Vietnam War, when I spoke out for women's rights, when I fought for environmental causes, I knew criticism would come. I expected it because I believed in the work. But what you've done today isn't brave or principled. You've just been rude for no reason other than thinking it would make good television." Joy finally found her voice, though it emerged as little more than a whisper. "I'm sorry if you feel I was rude." "I don't feel you were rude, Joy," Jane replied instantly. "You were rude. That isn't a feeling, that's a fact. And the apology would mean more if you understood what you're apologizing for." The other hosts exchanged uneasy glances, clearly aware of how thoroughly Joy was being dismantled, but none stepped in. "Let me give you some advice," Jane continued, her tone shifting to that of a teacher addressing a student who had gone too far. "Next time you have a guest on this show, try to treat them with respect. Ask questions that inform your audience instead of creating conflict. Listen to the answers instead of waiting for your next opening to attack." Joy nodded, silent and desperate for this ordeal to end. "And most importantly," Jane said, her voice firming as she reached her final point, "remember that your guests are human beings, not targets for whatever frustrations you're carrying. We come on to shows like this to have conversations, to share our experiences, to connect with audiences. We don't come here to be ambushed by hosts who haven't done their homework." The studio fell silent. The hum of the cameras were the only sound. Jane leaned back, having delivered one of the most devastating takedowns in daytime television. Joy Behar looked shattered, her earlier confidence replaced with humiliation. "Now," Jane said with a small smile that didn't reach her eyes, "would you like to ask me about my actual work, or should I assume the interview is over?" Joy looked helplessly. Whoopi stared at her hands, Sunny at the ceiling, and Sarah pretended to write notes. I think we should go to commercial," Joy managed. Jane rose gracefully, adjusting her blazer. "That's probably for the best. Thank you for having me, and I hope you'll consider what I've said." As the cameras cut away, Joy sat alone at the table, looking like she'd been run over. She had started this interview thinking she could expose Jane Fonda, but instead, she exposed herself, unprepared, unprofessional, and completely out of her depth against a Hollywood legend who refused to be pushed around. The audience left the studio in stunned silence, many shaking their heads at what they had witnessed. It was clear this would be remembered as one of the most brutal interview disasters in television history, and Joy Behar would forever be known as the host who got utterly destroyed by an 86-year-old actress who wouldn't tolerate nonsense. What did you think of this takedown? Have you ever seen a guest dismantle a host this completely? Share your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to subscribe for more moments like this.